Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with sports scientist and researcher at the Geelong Cats and Deakin University, Jackie Tran. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Valve Performance, makers of the Nord board. So if you haven't heard of the Nord board already, don't worry, I'll explain, it's pretty simple. So the Nord board is a fast and accurate way to measure hamstring strength. So as you know, practitioners can do very little about athlete age and previous hamstring injury. But they can do something about is the athlete's strength. So that's where the Nord board comes into play, giving you real-time hamstring strength readings to enhance training, monitoring and rehabilitation. It isn't going to make your athlete's hamstrings bulletproof, but what it is going to do is give you the right information so you, the practitioner, can make the right decision at the right time. The Nord board is now available, so if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, you can email info@valveperformance.com or visiting valveperformance.com. The Nord board is already in use by almost half the Premier League and dozens of other elite teams worldwide. So the Nord board hamstring testing system is the new standard for high performance sport. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Train with Push, creators of the Push Band. So the Push Band is the first scientifically validated wearable device to provide objective insights into your performance in the gym. So using accelerometers and a gyroscope, the Push Band is able to use bar speed to regulate load and volume based on your ability in the gym on any given day. So you can use the Push Band to quickly establish 1RMs with submaximal load so you can plan with confidence. So the Push Band portal also allows you to create programs before entering the gym to make change on the fly depending on how you are performing on that given day. So you can customize everything from target velocity ranges to differentiating velocities for warm-up and creating working sets and supersets for yourself or your athletes. So if you do want to know more about Train with Push and the Push Band, get yourself over to trainwithpush.com. They also have got a great blog, so you can catch up with some guest bloggers such as Mladen Ivanovic and Dan Baker. So be sure to check them out at trainwithpush.com. Thanks for tuning in to episode 74 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today, really excited to get Jackie Tran on. It's someone I've been stalking, as I mentioned in the episode, for quite some time. So it was great to get her on early in the morning for me, late in the evening for her. So I just want to thank Jackie for giving up her time. So if you don't know who Jackie is or want to find more out about her, just go to her website, jackietran.com. So that's JACQUIETRAN.com. And you'll find a lot more about her, whether it's her research or just her interests, and most importantly, her sketching, which is absolutely incredible. So keep this intro nice and short. Hope you enjoy the chat with Jackie. I'm sure you will. And just make sure you check out all the other resources that I mentioned in the episode. So like I mentioned, Jackie's website, make sure you check that out. So enjoy, and I'll speak to you soon. Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today we've got Jackie Tran on the phone. So just before I get Jackie in to give us a little bit of introduction, just want to thank her for her time and welcome to the podcast. So welcome to the podcast, Jackie.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure.
So like I mentioned, do you want to just give people a little bit of an introduction to who you are and your background and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, sure. So I am definitely a generalist as far as sports scientists go. I've bounced around a few different disciplines, but over the last few years I've been focusing my research on applied physiology, and it has focused on rowing training and performance. But my current role is, while it's still in research, it's in a completely different context again. I'm a research fellow at Deakin University and also working in conjunction with the Geelong Cats Football Club, which is an elite Australian football team. So my role is very varied, very multidisciplinary, and I get to draw on all the different bits of knowledge I've accumulated over the time and networks that I've developed over the time in physiology, biomechanics, elite sport, and in analytics and applied statistics as well. So there's a whole range of things that I do, but mostly it is about elite sports performance and applying scientific techniques to that. So pretty broad, but to me it all makes sense in my head. So hopefully it makes sense to someone else too.
So the rowing stuff, is that something that's a passion of yours, or is that just something that's kind of fallen your way?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, it was just a great opportunity that came across my desk. So I did my honours with Paul Gaston back in 2009. A little while ago, and that was a biomechanics-focused honours project. Then I took a year off after that, but Paul contacted me, in contact, and told me about a jointly supported PhD opportunity with Rowing Australia, the Australian Institute of Sport, and Deakin. And I decided to apply for that role because of the opportunity it would give me to work with some of the best of the best. And my external supervisor was Tony Rice, who is the National Sports Science Coordinator for Rowing Australia. So I hadn't had any connection at that point to the Australian Institute of Sport, and I wanted to continue working with Paul as well. So it just seemed a really good fit. At the time, I didn't know anything about rowing, actually, so I just threw myself in the deep end, quite literally, and it was a great learning experience. And I really developed a passion for rowing, but it didn't start off that way. So it was a great challenge for me to come into a sport where I didn't have any prior experience, and then have to learn as I go. But I think it gave me an advantage in some ways, because I was fresh eyes, and I was a bit of an outside observer to begin with. So I asked a lot of naive questions, but I think that was a good way to start a research project, is without any preconceived ideas about the sport. So yeah, my 4 years studying as a PhD student was really heavily focused on rowing, but have gone in a slightly different direction now, just as job opportunities have gone, but still very, very interested in rowing and pursuing that. So hopefully I can continue to apply my trade in rowing at some point down the line.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, I mean, it's quite a daunting thing for people, getting approached to work in a different sport they've never been involved in the past. Do you just want to talk to us about the kind of process that you went through to actually first not just learn about the sport and maybe, watch guys training and competing, but really get into the nitty-gritty of the sport to actually fully understand it? Do you just want to talk to us about that process that you went through?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that one of the things that is a very simple thing to do for me, it was to go out and try the sport and to get a physical sensation of what the sport is like, because I had never rowed before. So that for me was a new experience, just to even get a feeling, just as a lay person, I suppose, or a newcomer to the sport. I guess I also took on board the advice of a few people around me, and from conference presentations that I heard, keynote presentations. And one of the key things I remember Tim Gabbett mentioning at one of his many presentations was that the best things that he'd learned about sports science had come from standing next to a coach during a training session, observing them, asking questions, being unafraid to ask those naive questions. Why did you choose to do it that way? Or why have you structured in such a way? And so I really took that to heart and really pushed for opportunities to do that. So and my supervisors were very supportive of that as well, which was critical to it being effective. And so, Tony got me out on the water with some of the national coaches, and I was able to sit and observe training, ask them questions, and I learnt a lot that way. And I tried my hand at rowing. It wasn't very effective. I ended up on the wrong side of the river and had to be somewhat rescued by the club captain. But I tried it, and I got a feel for it and understood how technically it is. And so I guess I can say I have that first-hand experience. But I guess ultimately, one of Paul's pieces of advice to me when I was early on in my studies has really stuck with me, which is that if you're a good scientist, it really doesn't matter what sport you go to, because it all ultimately begins with understanding the needs and the demands of that particular sport. But the science, ultimately, the scientific methods and the scientific approach should be applicable across sports if you do that needs analysis up front. So I really wasn't daunted in a funny way. I was really excited by the challenge to throw myself into a completely new environment.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So one thing I found, so basically, just to take that back a bit, not with guests, I'll do a little bit of stalking online, which is always fun, going through people's Twitter accounts and personal websites and things.
Sure.
So one thing I came across with yourself was interest in kind of analytics and predictive modeling. So that's kind of a very, very broad term. Do you just want to give us a little bit of information on, firstly, the kind of predictive modeling that you were interested in, and what you were trying to predict with the work that you were doing and the thing that you're interested in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, to be honest, the predictive modeling that I had developed an interest in early on in my PhD, we never got there with my PhD, and it's still something that that I'm working towards. And I think largely because as I delved myself into this area was discovering that as much as many sports want to use this kind of approach to draw deeper insights and be able to potentially forecast events from their data, many environments, different settings, organizations need to get the basics of their data management right and data collection right. And so I've been spending, I would say, a lot of the last few years really working with all sorts of different individuals across different sports and organizations to improve that most fundamental level of data management. Before progressing to something more ambitious. But for me personally, I am interested in using large data sets over multiple years to look at team performance, and particularly moving now more into interactive patterns of behavior within teams and then between teams in invasion sports. So that's where my analytics research is heading, and I've got a couple of honours students working on parts and projects in that kind of area. So I'm interested in dynamic systems that will change second to second almost, or minute to minute throughout a game, depending on the status of who's winning and losing at different times. So I'm kind of interested in those sorts of questions as far as predictive modeling goes, and trying to identify patterns of team play that link more closely with success, or may match well against a different type of pattern, so that we might actually use this kind of analytical technique not just to, for example, there's some great examples of analytics in talent development and talent identification. There's ongoing work in injury prevention and risk management. I'm interested in using analytics from a tactical standpoint. So how can we use this information to make strategic decisions and help give more objective information to coaches when they're making their decisions about how to structure their team play?
Mm-hmm. Cool. So you mentioned there about the kind of basics of data collection. For me, there's a big disconnect between kind of using statistical methods in like a master's or an undergrad to get through an assignment, but actually using that on them techniques in the field. Do you just want to talk to us a little bit about what you mean by the basics of data collection and how you're advising people in using them big data sets?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I think even it begins with small data, let alone big data.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, sometimes big data it can be easier to deal with because big data is typically collected using sensors or teams of data analysts who are bringing data together. So there is a sort of an inherent structure to it already. But there is a lot of small data that we use in sport that isn't necessarily structured very well, or even collected in a systematic and a consistent, reliable way. So some of the advice that I guess I share with the people that work with me are around having a real clarity around the processes of collecting the data. So having standard operating procedures for data collection, having standard operating procedures for data cleaning to make sure that the same process is followed, even if someone happens to be on leave or someone happens to move organizations or change sports or change careers. We have a lot of issues with data being kept in a consistent manner, not because there isn't the database to store it or servers that are big enough. That's typically not the problem that I've encountered in the sports that I've worked with. The problem is usually because there is a large throughput of staff. Sometimes quite a rapid turnover of staff. Processes change and they're not documented. And so when one person leaves, their processes go with them. And it's not always very clear how they got from A to B to C. So sometimes it's just the real basics of writing everything down, having an instructional manual and following the same procedures every time you go through a reproduced process. It's a lot of teaching that kind of basic stuff. When I say basic, I really do mean basic. And also understanding things like data types, understanding the difference between continuous and discrete data, or ordinal and interval data and ratio data, and these are things that can seem really dry to sports science and exercise science students. A lot of times they come into this kind of degree, not to become math whizzes, and that's not my intention either to make them into math whizzes, but some appreciation for the mathematical logic is really important to work with data well and to use it well for the purposes of actually changing behavior and changing performance.
Mm-hmm. How much of an influence is this kind of I don't know what to call it, kind of fashion almost about data? How do you think it's kind of affecting not just the kind of traditional, what you might class as a sports scientist, but the kind of even the coach? How much upskilling are the coaches needing in kind of 2016 in this what I call fashion of collecting lots of data? Are you finding that there's the gap is kind of growing, or do you think that we're doing as scientists doing a good job of kind of keeping everyone in that sync, if that makes any sort of sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I think there's always upskilling to be done. I think it kind of feels like maybe my observations from 5, 6, 7 years ago, when I started to notice that there were more senior or elite level coaches who actually had gone and pursued sports science studies themselves, so that they could feel informed enough to have those discussions with the sports scientists that they worked with, rather than just taking them on their word. They actually could be informed enough to have real debates and discussions about different sports science approaches. And I think that's where we're at now with using data to inform coaching practice, is that there are coaches out there who have a good understanding of math and others who do need to upskill. But it's not just math, I suppose. It's also, I guess, a data literacy. And I think there is some way to go, but certainly some of the coaches I've worked with have been great and picked it up really quickly. Some have already come, I guess, ready-made with those skill sets, maybe from other careers that they've had throughout their lives. And some, want to use this kind of technique but don't know where to start, and they don't have a math background or a science background or a data background, and they know that they've got some work to do to understand this. But I see it as being a matter of time, and I think it's overall the fashion or the trend of utilizing statistics and utilizing data more intelligently in sport. I think ultimately it's a positive thing, because it means that more people are asking questions of the available information, rather than, okay, you're the analyst or you're the sports scientist, you tell me what you think. This way we can have more eyes on it, asking more questions. And I think that ultimately means we hopefully get to better answers.
Mm-hmm. So that's obviously a very daunting thing for a coach to be kind of educated in that way, because I'm guessing that when these coaches, decided to be a coach at 30, 35, 40, whatever it was, they probably didn't realize that somebody would be telling them about statistics and maths and things like that. But what is the process that you go through to kind of introduce them and maybe educate them? Because obviously it's not an easy thing to be doing.
Yeah, I think it comes back to something that gets hammered into you when you're a research, and at the time you think it's pretty cliche, but it really does apply in terms of teaching or engaging people in content which might be a bit daunting to begin with. So, in research, we get told all the time, what's the question? What's the question? What's the question? What's the question that you're asking? And so if you focus it around the problem that's trying to be, that a coach is trying to solve, then their engagement comes along with that. But if you come at it from a perspective of, okay, we're going to sit down for an hour and we're going to talk about data, well, you'll see their eyes glaze over in a millisecond. Yeah.
Gone.
But if it's, hey, I know that you're having, you're having some concerns about how, this particular structure may or may not be working. Let's look at some information that might help us answer that question, whether or not it's working. And then if it's a problem that they're solving, then I guess it may still be daunting, but they can push through it because they're looking for a solution to their coaching problem, not their math problem.
Yeah, I understand. Cool. So just another one that came up in the stalking session, which didn't take much stalking, to be honest, was your interest in understanding training load, and we've discussed it a little bit with regards to your kind of your rowing stuff, but I just want to talk to us a little bit about, firstly, why that interest exists and how we as scientists, coaches, whatever it may be, go about introducing a method of analysing training load and maybe the different caveats that exist in that question.
Yep, sure. Yeah, I guess to answer the first part of the question, where my interest comes from, I guess where it really stems from is the fact that that's the major stimulus that we have. That's the major way that we affect change in athletes and try to stimulate adaptations and try to ultimately improve performance. So to me, it seems like a logical first point for a young sports scientist to focus on is the big rock of how we manage training, how we prescribe it, how we adjust it, and how we can get a picture of whether what they've done matches what we thought that they would do. And I think that's in some sports can be relatively straightforward. I will say with that bit of a disclaimer there, or a bit of an out clause. I think that in the team sport setting or in the football setting where I am now, it's incredibly difficult because you have such a range of demands on the body. So you have locomotor demands, and you have central cardiovascular demands, you have neurological demands, neurophysiological demands, you have perceptual and psychological demands, and they all have their different ways of being captured, but to integrate that into one understanding of how demanding was training today or this week is a really, really difficult thing, whereas in other sports it's slightly easier. For example, in a more standardized environment like swimming, you don't capture everything by capturing distance and speed and internal measures that you might capture, lactates, heart rate, whatnot. You don't get it's not quite as it's not straightforward. It's not completely simple, but it is simpler than something like football, where you've got a lot of different factors that can affect training and not be represented well in the training load units sometimes, or training load measures that you might select. So I think that's I guess that the challenge of that is attractive to me, and that it is such a fundamental part of athlete management. So those two things have really fueled my interest in the area. And I guess, in terms of recommendations, I guess I'm no closer to it than anyone else in terms of advising what the best way to monitor load would be. But again, I guess it starts from really identifying what are the demands of the sport and being as open-minded about that as possible. Not thinking about, let's just capture the physiological load, or let's just capture how far they've run. That might be a starting point, but I think the best load monitoring systems that I've seen have been multifaceted, have incorporated multiple measures and have really brought the athletes and the coaches along with the purpose of doing that and the value of doing that. I've seen load monitoring systems implemented where there are 5, 6, 7 measures taken of training, but that hasn't necessarily been communicated well to athletes and coaches, and then it just seems like an exercise in recording information. And so I think there's two components to an effective load monitoring system, and it's having multifaceted measures that capture unique information from each other, and also having the athletes and coaches engaged in that so they can actually provide information as necessary, but also query it and provide additional information, contextual information that might help to decide, okay, today was a hard session and the number looks a little bit different, but the athletes and the coaches have important information to tell us as well about whether or not that was a demanding session or not. So trying to integrate that objective, subjective, external, internal, it's very complex, but at the same time, I think that's really the way that we have to go if we want to monitor load well. But it probably starts from a simple base, and then you build from there step by step.
Do you think there's a little bit of a missing link there that people forget about, that input from coaches, from technical coaches? Or is that something that you think is done well with regards to letting them have feedback on this in this process?
I guess maybe it depends on the sport.
Okay.
I haven't worked personally in cricket, for example, but from colleagues and friends who have worked in cricket, the technical coaching side of it feeds into the load monitoring, because it's about number of balls faced, the number of balls bowled, and okay, today we were doing lots of speed work in terms of the bowling, or today we were doing more placement and accuracy, and we're backing off on the speed. So the coaches feed into that process of understanding load. But I think in other sports, there's a huge opportunity there to better understand the demands placed on athletes by involving the coaches in that process, and not making it this is just the fitness department's job to monitor load. Actually, it's everyone's job. It's the athletes, it's the coaches, it's the sports scientists and the fitness staff and the medical staff, and it's everyone's responsibility. So I think that there are opportunities to improve in that respect, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So for someone coming into a new role or their first role, which I think is probably important for the guys that have been around for a number of years as well. But what would be the kind of first port of call with regards to setting up a system to understand training load? What's the first thing that you would suggest is sit down and do what?
The first thing that I would do is see what's been done before.
Okay.
And I think if it's your first effort at establishing a system, even if you have your own ideas about what the perfect system might be in a particular sport, so much of it is about shaping behavior and having people engaged in the process. So I think it's important to firstly assess what has been done, what has worked, and also what hasn't worked and why, because that may be revealing about the ways that you might choose to deliver future changes. I can think of some great examples from water polo and from the Australian water polo program, particularly the women's program, where I remember hearing a talk from Andrea Mosler, who is now at Aspire Academy, but spent a long time with the women's water polo team at the AIS. And, I think we're going back now, probably it's 10, maybe 15 years, where they started off with really simplistic load monitoring. It was, how many hours of training did you do today? And don't tell me anything else. I just want that basic information, because what had come before that was very little. And then from there, Andrea built on that, and they saw the value of recording, okay, player X has done 15 hours this week and player Y has done 20. So, player Y has done 25% more than player X. And what implications does that have for recovery, for injury risk, and so forth? And then in that process of having a very simple load monitoring system, then the coaches and the athletes started to ask questions and go, oh, well, yeah, she did 20, but it was 20 easy hours and I did 15 hard hours. So how do you represent that? And then you start to get those questions, and then you can build and say, okay, well, yeah, training hours only captures an aspect of volume. Now we need an intensity measure. So how about let's measure some intensity? These are some methods that we can do that. So I think it's about chaining it and starting from where you're at rather than trying to implement, the ideal system from day dot. I think every system can improve a little bit, but it's about having incremental change and bringing your athletes and your coaches along that journey with you.
Very interesting. So I just want to bring the one of the points I had towards the end forward, just because firstly it's interesting to me,
Sure.
which is the sketching side of things. So if anyone hasn't seen your sketches, they're unbelievable. But do you want to just talk to us about, firstly, why you do them, and what does it give to you, and what do you feel it gives to people that are reading them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have to say that I still continue to be surprised at the impact and the reach of my sketch notes, because when I started doing them, they really weren't for anyone else. They were for me and to enhance my own understanding. I realized that, as I started to attend more conferences as a research student, I found that I was taking all these really boring notes, line after line after line of text-based notes. And I would never go back and look at them because I didn't want to look at them. They were boring and, they were my own notes, but I didn't care to revise them. And so I felt like I was going away from these conferences not having absorbed a lot of information. And so I was trying to find a way to do that better. And when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, I used mind maps a lot to help me with my writing. And so I thought I'd adapt it for the purposes of attending seminars, workshops, and conferences. And then I think one of my friends saw me doing one of these sketch notes, and they said, "Oh, that's pretty cool. You should share that with some people." And I had a blog where I still have this blog where I write from time to time, and I thought, well, why not? I'll just publish it and see what happens. And like I said, I continue to be surprised that will find it engaging and find it useful for their own learning. Because for me, the learning comes from the actual process of doing the notes. I actually find I don't really look at my own sketch notes either, but somehow I absorb more information just from the act of putting my virtual pen to paper and synthesizing that information rather than taking notes on my laptop or writing barely legible text on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
So that's really where it starts from, and I found it to be really effective for my own learning and surprisingly really engaging for other people too.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you mentioned it to me before we started recording, but where do you take these notes, and what kind of implements do you use to take them?
Yep, it's a pretty simple setup. So I use an iPad and a stylus in terms of hardware, and software I use an app called GoodNotes, and that's one word for anyone who wants to look that up. So they've got a free version that you can try out, and they've got a paid version as well, which has some more features. But the free version is pretty good, and I use that for a long time. And that's essentially my process. I'll sit down at a conference or a conference presentation or workshop. I try to arrive a little bit earlier and write down the title of the presentation, do a little sketch of the speaker if possible, write down their name just to make it a little bit interesting for me, and just find get myself into the right mindset, because it is a very demanding exercise. It requires you to listen very carefully and also synthesize information while you're receiving new information throughout the course of a presentation. So I find I need a few minutes to focus myself and prepare myself for the next 15, 20, 30 minutes. And then I sketch live. My process varies. Sometimes I will sketch live and complete the sketch pretty well in the first 10 or 15 minutes after a presentation is finished. Sometimes my perfectionism gets the better of me and I spend more time afterwards, so it can be double the presentation time, where it might be an hour presentation and an hour of editing and cleaning up before I actually publish it to the world. But these days I try to make it as efficient as possible.
Interesting. So, excuse me. So I'm going to bring the the second to last point towards the back. So just another thing, again, back on the stalking. I'm not some complete weirdo, but the wearable kind of conversation, which I'd like your knowledge and experience on. It was something that I discussed, not necessarily wearables, but technology was something I discussed with a guy over here who came on the podcast a few episodes ago. And people getting roped into buying a piece of technology and taking their data as gospel, and not going through a process of, okay, is this data that it's given me, is this actually correct? I'm making decisions off this. So what process, firstly, would you go through this kind of process that he went through in actually making sure that it's doing what it says it's doing? And if so, what does that process look like?
Yeah, look, I think that there are a whole range of measurement properties that we need to consider, and I think we are continuing to improve our processes as a community, as a sports science community, around understanding the measurement properties of the different measures that we have, particularly the sensor technologies that continue to advance faster than our ability to study them. But I think there are some really good examples from how this is done in, I guess, I hesitate to say it a little bit, but I guess higher stakes environments like the medical setting, where the accuracy of a measurement tool may be the difference between making a decision that, negatively or positively impacts someone's health and their prognosis. So in those environments, measurement properties are at the forefront of people's minds. How accurate is this blood pressure monitor? How accurate is the oxygen saturation measurement? All those sorts of things. Those are questions we don't ask, I think, as readily in sport because it's not life or death usually for most of us. But the concepts stay the same. So, the different aspects of validity, not just comparing to other measures that do the similar things, but comparing to whatever the true gold standard is. I guess one of the difficulties with that is that there are some things in sport which we don't have a gold standard for. And, we were talking about training load before, and we don't have, one conventional known gold standard of measuring training load. So there's no way for us to really have established criterion validity because there is no gold standard to compare to. But we can look at, is it valid compared to other things that we know measure training load, some aspect of it. So validity is one massive part. Reliability always comes into it, particularly from the perspective of sensor technologies, where you'll have the manufacturing of many tens of thousands of devices potentially, and there could be variations between devices. So knowing whether there are differences between devices or even differences between when different operators are using a device is important and can be accounted for, but sometimes we don't go through that process because it seems tedious. If we go through that process, we can actually identify known systematic error and eliminate that from our calculations or account for that error so that we can improve the accuracy of the final numbers that we're using to make decisions. I guess, it also comes down to questions of feasibility and burden, and those are still really important questions that I think sometimes get lost in the argument about validity and reliability. I think burden is something that we always need to consider, even though wearing a watch or wearing some sort of biometric sensor stitched into clothing seems to be less burden than other techniques, invasive techniques as an example. I think we still need to think about, it can be a bit of a pain to have to put a monitor on your wrist every night to monitor your sleep and to remember to do that every single night. And, if you're traveling, you might forget it and leave it at home. And these are all very practical considerations that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds and try to perhaps smooth that path, or at least keep it in the front of our minds when we're organising to implement some sort of wearable solution into sport.
Mm-hmm. So just taking GPS for an example, with more kind of affordable units coming on the market, and people taking them up more probably even though they're maybe focused on a kind of consumer unit, people are taking them on as team units for football clubs, whether it be academies or first teams. So with that said, what will be the process in making sure that obviously people are making decisions, like we've said, off these pieces of technology? With GPS, what would be the process of making sure that data that it's giving me or you is actually usable and available to make decisions from? What would be that process to make sure that's happening?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there are some great examples of GPS validation that really could be mimicked in a lot of ways if people wanted to internally validate for themselves, or even as research projects, some of these consumer units for movement monitoring. Aaron Coots did a lot of great work around this sort of in the late 2000s, so around 2010, give or take a few years. And the process that Aaron and his colleagues followed, I think, is a really sound one that can be adapted as needed, which is to develop movement circuits that mimic the demands of whatever sport you're wanting to monitor, and then simply having people wear multiple devices at the same time while doing the same circuit, and looking at the accuracy of those two devices, the comparative accuracy and reliability. And I think also an important thing is to for people to understand that these sensors and wearable devices do have a range of error. So yeah, a lot of consumer devices will present a single number to represent what you've done in that session. You might get a reading that says, yep, you've run 5Ks today. But the truth of it is that every sensor has some amount of error, even if it's a minute amount. And I think we need to be understanding of the fact that even the best devices do have a plus or minus. It's 5Ks plus or minus a certain amount. And that might be 5 meters, or it could be 50 centimeters or 5 centimeters, but there is still error. And I think when we can understand that, then we will come to a more sensible and sensitive use of sensor technologies and the data that they provide us. And that, I think, then allows us to make better decisions with confidence, or perhaps without confidence. Because if we're getting a device that says, hey, you've run 5Ks today, plus or minus 2Ks, then we know that kind of device is not giving us very useful information. But if we come to the understanding that, hey, it's 5Ks plus or minus 5 centimeters, then that's perhaps an amount of error that we can live with. Mm-hmm. So I think that in terms of establishing whether consumer devices are appropriate for monitoring athletic performance, it does come down to understanding the measurement properties of those devices, but also knowing how much error are you willing to live with, and what you might be able to do to minimize that error as well. Is it a technical thing? Is it something that is inherent to the sensor? Can you improve the way that you, start all the devices at the same time, perhaps? Or can you change training venues to have a greater access to satellites compared to covered areas? And all these small things add up to improve the performance of even consumer level devices, which are becoming not just increasingly available and affordable, but they are increasingly accurate. It's just that you do need to go through the process of establishing that, because the pace of change is so fast that the research evidence to support these devices and their accuracy and reliability does tend to lag behind the actual advancements in hardware and software.
Mm-hmm. Cool, very interesting. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time up, but just want to give us just let us know where people can keep up to date with what you've going on, and most importantly, the sketches. Where can people get to see the sketches?
Sure.
Do a bit of stalking of their own.
Yeah, sure. The easiest place is really my website, which is www.jacquietran.com. So that's JACQUIETRAN.com. So that's a central point for all the places I exist on in the internet sense, all the different platforms and different networks that I have a presence on. So that's probably the best place, but you can also look at my blog. That's phdblog.jackietran.com, and that's where you can find my sketch notes. There's a link up the top, so you can easily navigate to that. Or you can also tweet me. So my handle is Jackie Tran as well, same spelling as my website. And feel free to tweet me anytime, and always happy to chat and engage with people. But I always do find it funny that as a sports scientist, I get asked so much about my sketch notes. So who knew that I could find my way into an illustration career through sports science?
Hey, it's worked for other people. Maybe not illustrations, but infographics and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's a lot of fun, and it's a part of my job that I never envisaged that would be part of my job, but I really enjoy it, and it adds a lot of variety, and I'm always happy for people to ask questions, or if they want to send sketch notes that they've done, then that's even better. I love seeing people engage in it as well.
Cool. Well, thanks again for your time, and really appreciate you coming on. So we'll keep in touch, and we'll speak soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jackie. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 74 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoy the chat with Jackie. So, as I mentioned in the intro, and we mentioned a couple of times throughout the episode, if you want to find out anything more about Jackie, her research, just her interest, or just her in person, get over to jackietran.com. So that's JACQUINTRAN.com. As I mentioned, actually, as I put out on Twitter a couple of days ago, the last 30 days have been really, really good for the podcast. Obviously, nothing to do with me, and solely to do with the great guests that have been on. So we've had just under 20,000 downloads in the last 30 days, which is superb. So thank you very much for all the support. Keep the ratings and reviews coming on iTunes. They're all really appreciated. Some great guests coming up over the next couple of weeks and months. And I will speak to you in episode 75. Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Head of Sky's Performance Hub, Scott Draw. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Valve Performance, makers of the NordBoard. So if you haven't heard of the NordBoard already, don't worry, I'll explain, it's pretty simple. So the NordBoard is a fast and accurate way to measure hamstring strength. So as you know, practitioners can do very little about athlete age and previous hamstring injury. But what they can do something about is the athlete's strength. So that's where the NordBoard comes into play, giving you real-time hamstring strength readings to enhance training, monitoring and rehabilitation. It isn't going to make your athlete's hamstrings bulletproof, but what it is going to do is give you the right information so you, the practitioner, can make the right decision at the right time. The NordBoard is now available, so if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, you can email info@valdperformance.com or visiting valdperformance.com. The NordBoard is already in use by almost half the Premier League and dozens of other elite teams worldwide. So the NordBoard hamstring testing system is the new standard for high-performance sport. Thanks for tuning in to episode 75 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today we've got Scott Draw, who has recently taken up a role as Head of Sky's Performance Hub. So as you can imagine, we are discussing his new role and his previous roles with England Rugby and UK Sport. So we discussed the use of technology in sport, research and innovation. We discussed building a team from delving into his background as a head of department at both them previous jobs. So we get his insight into recruitment, which was great, which we haven't really tapped into so far in the podcast. So thanks for tuning in to episode 75. Again, appreciate any feedback, and Scott mentions that right at the end. If you get any feedback for him, please fire it his way, whether that be on Twitter or directly on his email, which he gives out at the end. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you jumped over to iTunes and left an honest rating and review. It goes a long way to expose the podcast to other people so other people can listen and hopefully enjoy it. So let me know what you think to the episode with Scott, and I'll speak to you soon. Okay, hi guys. Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So just before I introduce Scott Draw onto the podcast, I just want to give a big thanks to someone that's almost become my agent over the last couple of months, in Chris Toombs, for making this connection once again. So just before I get Scott in to get us to give him a introduction on himself, I just want to thank him for his time on a Tuesday afternoon. So thanks a lot, Scott, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate it.
So do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction on your background, your education, what you're currently doing?
Yeah, so I'm 3 weeks into a new role with Sky and Team Sky, working on, a concept and a sort of virtual human performance institute. It's hard to say what it's going to be yet because we're still early days. So hopefully that'll become a lot more public knowledge as it sort of evolves. But hopefully a network that everyone from art, music, sport can tap into with some real expertise. Harnesses the very best of British science, medicine, engineering, and tech, and business, and all those great things and great people that people sometimes just want to get access to. Prior to that, previous 2 years working with England Rugby, so I sort of headed up a number of science and medicine teams across the men's player pathway with women's and sevens, and then a period before that, really from early 2000, really up to past London, I worked in the British Olympic system with UK Sport and EIS, and I helped develop and grow our research innovation program, which is really about working with sports in a project-based way, trying to solve problems that they presented to us with the very best of science, medicine, engineering, and tech, but also bring new ideas to them of things that have gone on in the industry that could potentially make a difference to their journeys, to their individual athlete journeys, really, as they headed into major tournaments and major events. So that's predominantly my history. Studied at Loughborough, did my PhD there in injury risk, first degrees at Brunel and teaching degree at Nottingham. So really, really varied background. Probably the way I sort of describe myself is an expert generalist with this cast and network of thousands who are real specialists and expertise in what they do, and that's where my sort of career's got to.
Cool. So one thing I wanted to kind of start off with was the research and innovation kind of head of yours. So it was just from my kind of a lot of these questions are very selfish that I ask on the podcast, and I kind of figure out that if I'm interested in it, I'm hoping and guessing that other people are. So it was just the journey from kind of a problem being presented to you, whether it be something that can be solved with technology or other means, and the kind of research that goes in behind that to actually hopefully solve that problem from your side, from kind of a management point of view, if that waffle makes any sense.
Yeah, and if I go right back to the start of, I guess, of the journey and the process, when I sort of when I ended up in a sort of role around research innovation tech, as it was really early days in the British system. So the EIS actually didn't exist at that time. So really in those early days, we spent a lot of time trying to scope the network and the landscape, going to a lot of places that existed in the UK, meeting people, in some ways doing a bit of a talent identification of expertise. So what we're trying to do is build this network and toolbox, if you call it, of experts, of people that had quite unique skills, who maybe hadn't previously worked in sport, that we could call on when problems evolved. So that was an ongoing, constant process. And we would contract experts on small projects just to test them out. How good were they? Could they adapt? Could they work in sport? And gradually we built this network that enabled us to, rapid respond, where sports would come to us and ask particular questions. And we already knew there were networks of people that we could bring together. The best analogy is a bit like the conductor of an orchestra. In some way, that's the way we worked. We were the conductor, sport was the audience. They come in and say, look, this is a problem I think we have. and we worked with them using particular skills to make sure that was the problem they had, to really get it quite defined, and then put the orchestra together of the right expertise. So whether that's specialists in textiles, in aerodynamics, in human sciences and metabolism, and like create these teams that were virtual but also face to face at particular times, that would work together over periods of time to solve a problem presented to us and then disband. And they may be working on multiple projects at once. We had lots of orchestras playing particular types of music. So that was the sort of analogy, but it was constant talent ID and confirmation of technical expertise. And we'd act as that bridge with the sport, knowing that there were various individuals that we could work with at any point in time to try to solve those problems. So it was it was an ongoing process. It grew from a team of 2 to a team of 14 that had a cast of thousands. And in effect, we created different work streams relative to the demands of sport that just grew organically over time. If I look back now at 03, 04, 05, 06, I'd never planned for it to end up like it did. It just meant the needs of sports and the questions being asked meant we ended up with this, I guess, theme of work around product, technology, bikes, boats, paddles. We ended up with a theme of work of which has traditionally now been known as big data, where there were questions around how to measure things in the field. It meant, miniature electronics and hardware. It meant wireless telemetry. It meant software. It meant end user displays. It meant databasing. It meant feedback. It meant all of those things, which are ultimately about designing and changing skills in the field. We ended up with a stream of work that we call training science, where, fundamentally we're going to ask questions about the training process. How can I, and that was everything related to, training order, training recovery, all those types of things. And then a stream of work we end up calling athlete health, which fundamentally was about trying to work with sports to give athletes days back to training. And that language was developed by a guy called Glenn Hunter, who headed up the athlete health team. But it was a great concept around just trying to think, if we can give days back, you'll develop and adapt, which is really fundamentally what it's about. So we had these streams of work and just people working across in a matrix way, just trying to solve problems, but equally try to present new ideas and ways of solving problems they didn't even know they had, but by creating those relationships that enabled us to move quite quickly. So that was the essence of it. It was really organic. It was constantly moving. It was like a speedboat in some ways, where it wasn't a super tanker. We could react really, really quickly because over time we built this network across GB and international of academics, of industrial specialists that were just ready to go.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now and just ask you if you had a cool example of something you mean by taking that journey through from initial to completion.
Yeah, I think as a team we were really fortunate to work with British cycling in the early days around what became known as the Secret Squirrel Club. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's probably the most unsecret club there ever is. You can Google it. But in effect, it was an early attempt, and probably Great Britain were the first to do it, to really have a really good look at aerodynamics in cycling, because it's the biggest resistive force. Now, historically, nations had tried to do odd bits and things in an ad hoc way. We took a real serious approach to it, recruited really good experts in aero and textiles and material science and manufacture, and just went for it in a really big way. And over a 4-year period, particularly from Athens into Beijing, ended up really understanding those forces which slow athletes down at exceptionally high speeds, from athlete positioning to clothing to bike design. And then that repeated going into London as well, and it's going to go on again into Rio. So that was one of the biggest bits of work. But by doing that, we could take the knowledge and apply it to winter sport. So you learn so much about that process. You're suddenly able to work with skeleton in a really quick way, going into the winters 2 years later after our Summer Olympic Games, and then to bobsleigh, and then to snowboard cross, and then transfer that knowledge to rowing, into canoeing and various other bits. So often one sport, and cycling were the real innovator here, and we were trying to support them, really push the boundaries. And in our roles, sitting in the helicopter, we could transfer and translate that knowledge and application really quickly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So is there any industry or sector that you've kind of not expected to delve into to solve these problems in sport, but has ended up being a real success story?
Well, one of the most difficult industries to get access to was Formula One. More than 80% of Formula One engineers are British, and we have this space in the UK called Motorsport Valley, where most of the teams and all the industry is based. So it was always a challenge of how do you get into that environment, and how do you get into those types of places? Because you think you absolutely believe that they're a cutting edge and they're going to places where nobody else is going. So actually what we found going into that, of course it blows you away what's possible, and a lot of it would never work in an Olympic sport, but just some of the people we met, and there's one individual, particularly Caroline Hargrove at McLaren, was just asked really good questions all the time in such a smart way that it would just make you really think about what you were doing. So we had a great example at the time. There's one of the coaches for the team pursuit, and when they're cycling around the velodrome, which everybody would have seen, she was just asking questions about the particular order of riders and how they changed like they did, and just the coaches at the time just took a step back and really thought about the way they trained. So you're going in there looking at something particular, and something else came out of it, and that made them really think about the process of what they're doing, and that's moved on since then. So that was gave us a sort of just the quality of people, their ability to, even though they're specialists in their own field, they would look at your world very, very differently and ask the types of questions which you took for granted. And that was always part of the process that we were trying to create that type of environment where people felt comfortable to be challenged and felt comfortable where they could fail and fail fast. Pixar talk about this, if you can fail fast and learn from your lessons and move on, it's the competitive advantage you're looking for. And by working with some sports and other industries and related worlds, you could create that environment where failing fast was accepted, and it meant you could move on really quickly.
So have you been on the flip side of that, when you've been brought into an industry that you're not familiar with, and you've been put forward to kind of ask them questions?
Yeah, it sort of happens naturally. Okay. Because we're constantly looking at engaging with related worlds, as I call them, like just places that you wouldn't normally go to be honest. So motorsport there's some similarities, but you get into America's Cup. We created a relationship once with I'm just trying to name it. Was it Warburton the bread maker? They have an innovation department, and we met up with these guys once at a conference, and they were just really intrigued in what we're doing, and they were looking at creative ways and new food technology, and they just wanted us to come in and look what they're doing. So it's fun, it's great fun, because in some ways you're out your comfort zone, but also they're in a position where they're really accepting of what you're seeing, because they're so used to seeing what they see. So yeah, that was fun.
So you used to see bread.
Yeah, you design a different loaf of bread, but they were. It just amazes you about what they were looking for. They family-owned business, but deliberately had an innovation department, and they worked with their industry and business to move it on. It just mind blows you sometimes how what people are trying to do to continue to develop their business.
So when I was stalking your Twitter feed last night, just came across. I am some sort of weirdo, I think, but that's fine. It came across a couple of tweets that mentioned Google and how they kind of manage and run manage their staff, basically. Yeah. Have you been involved in the kind of the real business, the kind of hardcore business end of things in your kind of relationship building along the way? We've obviously linked with, as part of that process, we have linked with major businesses just to see can learn around how you manage leads, support and develop your people. And in many ways sometimes sport is pretty sophisticated. Sometimes you think the grass is always greener, but sometimes the way I guess and the way staff can be managed and supported in their roles is just, sport sometimes is pretty good. And you always do learn the way. It's interesting. I think someone had tweeted recently around how Google were trying to study how to create successful teams, and the main outcomes of that big read was actually they found like that emotional connection, really working around the person was the major things that they found out. And you're just like, well, we're pretty good at that in sport. The athletes predominantly always tries to be at the center of it. You try to coach and develop the person first, as opposed to them in their sport. So sometimes it flips both ways, if that makes sense. And just even though
we often look at traditional domain, just cross-sport sharing, cross-sport knowledge is where the real magic can be. And I mean, one of the things that we always encourage is try to make that happen, because there are lots of similarities, there are a lot of similar problems within the sporting arena, and sometimes your gains are just in sharing that knowledge with one another. I mean, I think I mentioned I was very fortunate to be at the Leaders event in Los Angeles last week, and give me a great insight into terms of where US sport is and its application of science, its application of tracking technologies. And there's some really smart people who do some really good stuff. And equally, some people are really in the early stages trying to implement really good programs. But you could just see how quickly people were learning off one another by just sharing experiences. And often it isn't rocket science, but it's just that moment for somebody that goes, yeah, what I was trying to do is exactly the right thing. I now got the confidence to go on and push it through. So like just the strength of sport sometimes is serious. And I think you have to sometimes recognize that sometimes the solutions are really close to you.
Mm-hmm. So this may be quite early on in your kind of discovery of this, but what are you seeing between the kind of evolution of sports science in the US compared to what it's like in the UK?
Yeah, I think this is internationally wide, not just within the US, but technology is often moving at a much faster rate than we can implement and manage it. So I think what you're beginning to see is many of the player tracking technologies, sports are using them in the US, particularly because there's peer pressure. They hear one team is doing something, so like we have to do it to be the same. And what isn't driving the use of that is really good intelligent questions. So what you're getting is a vast collection of data without any direct application. So people are going fishing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You have to do that at times, but they're going for fishing and they get to the end of a data collection period at the end of a season and just don't know what to do with the information. Or they still have data because they haven't been translated to quality information. So I think the ability, what you see with really experienced practitioners that are able to really step back, really tight relationships, part of their team, part of their coaching team. They can ask really, really intelligent questions, which often direct the use of the right tools and technology. So the tail isn't wagging the dog. The performance on the pitch, on the court, is driving the work of the performance team. So you're beginning, that was just some early observations, and I'm generalizing here. There's obviously examples of really good stuff going on, but I think that will flip quite quickly when people realize actually there's, how are we going to keep up with this technology? Well, in some ways you don't have to. If your process is good, if the questions you ask are related to what happens on the pitch and the court and the field or the track, you will therefore go to the right solutions that will help you answer those questions. And success will still be judged by your intervention. Any of these tools and technologies are going to tell you something, you still got to do something about it. And that's where the real competitive edge is in international sport.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to technology, and obviously there's so many new products entering the market, what do you think is going to be the kind of thing that comes to the fore over the next couple of years from the kind of things that you're seeing at the minute?
Yeah, I think certainly in the Consumer Electronics Show this year, huge push around this whole virtual reality, augmented reality space. So, creating these different learning environments, what that may mean is you're just going to see it coming through in a number of domains. It is beginning to happen in sport. Again, I think we've just got to be really cautious around this as it begins to, because it's the commercial products which are relatively low cost, which means you can take a risk and try some things out, for minimal interference in some ways. But equally, because we're dealing with skills and learning, and there's a lot to do with education and practice, we've just got to be really cautious we're not doing any damage, teaching people the wrong things. So this technology is going to be forefront, and people are going to see its capacity and opportunity. But I think the really good people will just take a step back and really think about what they're trying to achieve and whether this fits that. But but be ready. Your phone technology and all of this capability is going to change the way we think, live, and operate.
So just to kind of move on slightly, I'd kind of put in my notes about finding an edge.
Yeah.
And I'd kind of use that to kind of jog my memory. So you're in a kind of team sports setting, not a lot of people have got tons of cash to kind of throw around. You're kind of trying to get an edge, whether it be in an academy setting to recruit kids, to make them better and not let them get swallowed up by a big academy, but you're wanting to create this edge to bring them to your place, or various different examples. But what would be your kind of process going forward to actually figure out how you're going to find that edge, and what kind of differs, how we differ from X club or Y club, to be able to either develop more players, attract more players, whatever it may be? What would be that process going forward?
This is going to sound a bit of a cliche, but I think sometimes it's just about doing the basics better than anybody else. I think the really good programs that you see just have really, really good people who have great team dynamics, great cohesion, consistent goal. Everybody's hit. Everyone's sort of behind it. It's bumpy. Every journey that you engage on, every performance environment should be bumpy. There should be a bit of chaos. But ultimately, it comes down to the quality of that people and how well they work together. I guess more than 15 years experience now across multiple sports. You realize that that's the thing that makes a difference. As good as all science, medicine, technology, innovation, and all those concepts can be, that only flourishes when all the other bits are right. So, that comes down to clarity of vision, clarity of mission, objectives, empowering your staff to have capabilities to get off and try stuff out, and making it fun. Your environment's got to be fun. You want to be bouncing out of bed every day. So all those things are where your competitive edge is. But the things that are also hardest to develop. And that needs, you just got to be on it every day to create the right environment, which enables, not just athletes, but staff, people, administrative staff, just to flourish. And seems a bit simple, but I think that's where that's where the competitive opportunities are.
Mm-hmm. So I hear that quite a bit with regards to doing the basics really well. So if so many people are kind of banging that drum, what is the reason for people complicating things? Why do people seem to be complicating things?
I mentioned about this case, and yes, I think sometimes there's peer pressure to always be demonstrating you're having an impact. Everybody's asked, what difference are you making? And having hard evidence around how you do that. I've been really intrigued by the concepts around storytelling and using storytelling as a way of communicating the type of things that you're doing. And in LA, I was really fortunate to meet a couple of people who work in high performance medicine in the US that are using storytelling to enable clinicians and real high technical people to tell that story. And I think that's a much more powerful way of how we can demonstrate impact, and therefore there is less pressure on us to just, take the next greatest bit of technology, apply the next greatest intervention, because the secrets often aren't there. So I think what we've got to do is find better ways of actually communicating what we do as technical specialists that support coaches and support athletes. And maybe that is through the power of storytelling, which is a way that you can articulate the journey that you've been on, which we know is organic, we know it's dynamic, we know it's never a straight line from A to B. And I think we have to think harder about that. So certainly the pressures around demonstrating you as an individual having an impact, put that pressure on. And in the worst case, this type of situations we saw in Essendon in the past few years means that people are looking for these edges and crossing the line, and there isn't any need for it. I think what we have to think much smarter about is how we tell the stories of working in a high performance team to create an environment and opportunity for that athlete to be the best they can. I think there are ways that we can do that. We just have to look a little bit harder, and work with everybody in our community to convince them that that's the direction we can go.
Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily the kind of bit of technology or the cash that you're going to spend. It's how that is then communicated and fed back to athletes, coaches, support teams.
Yeah.
Do they have storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really powerful way of sharing emotion and the emotive part of what these journeys can be, and that's what really connects people together. If people believe that's the way to go, we'll avoid that chasing of the next greatest thing, because the reality is there isn't a next greatest thing. The next intervention isn't going to make the massive difference that you're thinking about. It's taking part of the big pieces of the jigsaw. And I just think as practitioners across science, medicine, engineering, and coaching, being able to articulate these stories in a storytelling, much more emotive way could really help people understand the value of how the teams try to support that individual.
So just a couple of last things that I kind of want to pick your brain about was was around building a team.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've read you mentioned Google a couple of times, a book called Work Rules, which is recommended to me, which is basically the head of HR at Google, and talks about how they how they recruit and how they manage their staff. And I just want to kind of get I know it's very, very broad, just get your take on, firstly, recruiting staff, and how you may go about that, and how you manage people in general.
Yeah. I love that book, by the way.
It's great. It's unbelievable.
And for all your readers, I would also recommend, before I answer the question, read a book called Social Physics by a guy called Sandy Pentland from MIT's Media Lab. So he's been fundamentally looking at ways of quantifying teams, quantifying the social networks of people. It's really got my brain spinning around around how you can quantify the dynamics of teams. And they've done some really interesting stuff, not in sport, just demonstrating how those communication networks are often the best predictor of team success. So have a look at that one, Social Physics, Sandy Pentland, really great read. In terms of my sort of experience, I guess first thing I always look for is passion and enthusiasm. Particularly in the teams that we work with, we've been very fortunate that we've had to be future looking. But those types of capabilities of people being able to demonstrate, I guess, that passion, but also, I guess, be risk taking, but balance in some ways around that. So people are really willing to try out ideas in a systematic way to further their knowledge. So those are the things that I look for. Of course, great technical knowledge, but a great ability to apply that to the circumstances that they're presented with. And that means you may know all the literature in the best possible way, better than anybody else. But when you're presented with a particular situation, with a sport, with an athlete or coach, how can you filter and extract that information, or have a high quality network that you can apply in the right way to that circumstance? So those are the real things that we typically look for. In terms of people I've managed to, been fortunate enough to manage and support and be part of a team, I guess traditionally just like to empower them to, I guess it's a bit of a cliche as well, but I guess they call it commander's intent in the US military, where you're pretty clear about what the outcome needs to be, but people have the flexibility, knowing that they're in quite an organic and dynamic environment, to find their way of getting there. And you give the freedom to constantly learn from that journey and that exercise. I think that's the way I like to manage and lead. I like the concept of the commander's intent, because the reality is when you're front line and you're out there, you can't predict the circumstances you're going to face. But what you need are the resources and capability and support from your team to know that, you may have to go back 2 steps to go forward 3 steps. You may have to go somewhere they haven't been before. And, and in sport, that's the nature of the game. You can plan to your heart's content, but there's a great quote that says, no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. So you need that flexibility. You need the capability to adapt constantly to try to achieve that outcome which we set as commander's intent. So for me, that's the framework I like to use when we're working together as a team. And not everybody can respond to that, but particularly in the field that we've worked with and within research innovation, I think you need to give that type of framework to enable people to demonstrate their capabilities and achieve their best in meeting that intent that you've set out.
So this is just going off a tangent a little bit, but in that recruitment process, how are you getting the people to demonstrate that they can be flexible in their approach, given, like you said about knowing the research inside out, but being able to decipher that and actually apply it to a problem? How are you doing that to make sure you've got the right people?
Yeah, so the focus is always on process. So like some things that we've done in the past is just set challenges which you don't expect people to solve. But so you take an example from industry around, I don't know, a car down, these are the types of circumstances, how would you deal with it? So what you're really looking for is, I guess, creativity in terms of how they create and generate ideas, but then the innovation element of it is how they take those ideas forward. So you just you're testing their process and their way of thinking and their ability to make things real. So a lot of role plays, a lot of circumstances, a lot of situations that people wouldn't expect, but also around that, a lot of personal time, a lot trying to understand those individuals and what others think of them. Yes, it's typically go through quite a sort of detailed process. It's, it can be 2 to 3 stages, but it helps you really understand how people think, but also what others think of them. But the key thing is about their process of thinking and working on problems, and deliberately presenting problems in that way where they've got to solve it and understand it from the end user's perspective. And often that's quite a challenge because you're not taught that in education. You're taught everything in ologies, you're taught everything in a very particular way, but that in effect gives you your toolbox. It's when presented with a particular problem. It's not this paper told us this and this. What are the circumstances for this individual? What's the context? How can I filter all of this information to help solve or bring a new opportunity to the table that's going to work? I mean, the relationship part is massively crucial as well. You can't underestimate. We call them soft skills, but all the communication element of needed in the job. The emotional intelligence, the EQ, all of those skills to be much more self-aware, much more self-organizing, so people make good decisions when under pressure.
Cool. So just one very last thing. Obviously, the people that listen to the podcast are kind of sports scientists, S&C coaches. What advice would you give them in the kind of avenues to look away from their kind of comfort zone to look for influence that may be able to help them to bring them back into their environment?
Good question. I think more than anything nowadays, I think one of our challenges, what everybody has, regardless of your training or discipline, is the amount of data and information that now exists. And I guess you've got to try to put in place some really, really good filters. Social media nowadays is somewhere that you'd always say, like, you've got to be on social media. You've got to be connected on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. You've got to connect with a lot of the top quality scientists that are out there that are, giving good insight and having good debate through these forums. So sometimes those provide a useful filtering environment. It's not the be all and end all. But I guess you also have to try to get out your normal sporting space. Go and visit people in other environments that think a bit differently from yourself. If you get a chance to go into F1, into America's Cup, into management schools, into all these other places, they're just going to broaden your thinking a bit, I guess, a lot more from the way you've been educated and developed. That happens over time. It's really simple stuff, but you have to be really proactive with these types of engagements. Go and see your colleagues in different sports. If you work in Olympic sports, get into pro sport. If you're in pro sport, get into Olympic sport. They all work slightly differently for different reasons. Get into extreme sports, get and see what Red Bull do. I think the broader that you can shape your experiences, the better prepared you'll be. And for that, you just have to be really proactive. And that's the best professional development environment you can create, is that engagement. So yeah, it comes down to that really. It's not overly complex, but over years you find those networks build and build and build, and when you suddenly face with a challenge or problem that somebody's presented to you, you can always call on those networks. I think that the diversity of social network is massively important.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So kind of leads on to my next question, was where can people get in touch with you?
Shall I say Twitter? No. But I'm on Twitter, Scott D UK, and I don't mind if people want to drop me an email directly. So that's drawer, as in a cupboard, DRAWER @teamsky.com. Get in touch. Happy to share experiences, happy to share learnings, happy to share where we've made massive mistakes. I'm on a new journey now as well. So I'd love people to comment and give feedback on this podcast as well, of things that resonated and things that didn't. So everybody has different experiences. I think the more we share them, the more we can learn from one another. Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll round up and just say thanks a lot for giving up your time and your insights. It's been fascinating. So thanks again, and we'll speak soon.
Great, and thanks for the opportunity, because it's always good to talk these things through, and I hope people enjoy what we've had to discuss.
No, pleasure, mate. Thanks very much. See you later.
Thanks.
See you, bye. Thanks for tuning in to episode 75 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat with Scott. Just before I let you go, there is number 4, so episode 4 of the Pacey Performance webinar series with Sophia Nymphius. So that's going on later in the month, but if you are interested in Sophia's webinar on change direction and agility in sport, you can go to paceyperformance.co.uk/Sophia. So check that out if you are interested. It'd be great to see you. I've already got plenty booked on already, so make sure you're one of them guys that books on if you are interested. So thanks again for all the support so far, and I will speak to you in episode 76.